So I've been asked to talk about the business case for infrastructure refresh in an IT context. This is something that is a consistent topic for discussion, especially in the last few years, where the reliability of systems plus economic pressure has tended to lead to people extending the operating life of their IT assets beyond what would have been previously thought as prudent. So now we're seeing increasing demands through digitisation, improvements in the economy, and we're seeing people coming back and revisiting questions such as, should we refresh our assets? Should we look at going to the cloud, which is another subject? The context for this discussion is around building a business case for doing a refresh of on-premise or your own IT assets, typically around the data centre context. One of the questions we're often asked are the cost implications of keeping or refreshing IT assets. Typically when assets are acquired, their initial acquisition comes along with a 3-year maintenance or warranty program, by which any spares or repairs are looked after under the cost of that contract. Once we get past 3 years, we get into what's called extended warranty, typically a year-by-year proposition, and so you have a year 4, a year 5, a year 6 as appropriate maintenance agreement. And when you're looking forward at your equipment, say it's 3 or 4 years old, what we see is a pattern whereby the extended maintenance charges, say for year 4 and out, tend to show a substantial increase over the initial costs of the first 3 years, well beyond CPI. And that's typically influenced by factors such as the spares that are required are possibly no longer current line stock. They're harder to get. They become more expensive as a result. And also they're not stocked as widely. So if you're not in Sydney, for example, you might find parts have to be shipped. And sometimes even if you are in a major metro area, sometimes the parts have to come from overseas. So these costs add to a total cost of ownership discussion or analysis. And so year 4, 5 and 6 tend to be far more expensive than year 1, 2 and 3 from a maintenance point of view. And that is part of what makes up a business case of looking at the pros and cons of keeping assets or refreshing them. Operationally, we find that one of the impacts of keeping assets beyond an initial 3 or 4 year life is the actual operational performance of the maintenance support that's available. So I alluded to this in the cost side of it, but it also has a performance impact. As in, if you have a key asset such as a server or a SAN and you have a hardware issue and the performance is therefore impacted, either it's slowed down or it's out of action, the older systems and the consequent difficulty in getting parts can lead to delays that are beyond what the business would normally expect. So for example, you may have to wait for a part to be shipped from interstate, you may have to wait for a part to be shipped from overseas. We certainly see instances where people resort to things like eBay to source parts in the aftermarket, which is not an ideal situation, but when you're faced with no option or going to eBay, eBay is an option. So what that means then is that you've got a key business asset, it might be 4 or 5 years old, it's had a hardware outage, and your business, which might be in healthcare or it might be delivering goods, is now waiting on eBay for a critical component to go into a critical asset that's going to support your business. So from a business case point of view, I guess it comes back to the risk profile that you're looking at and what you're happy to sustain from that point of view. A question that we're often asked relates to operating system and application support. Most software vendors are doing two things at the moment. One is they're rapidly converting their line of business to an as-a-service so that you can deploy from the cloud. But if you're deploying their software on your own premises, on your own premise equipment, They're continuing to add functionality and value for their clients. Obviously, they want to make the product sticky and they want you to keep using it. So they're adding features and they're adding performance demands as time goes on. Now, what we have seen is that the software in that business can outgrow the hardware capacity that's available to service it. And in that case, what happens is over time, your performance might decline and you might have issues with getting the software to deliver the functionality that you require. You may be limited in terms of new releases that you can take advantage of as well. So there is a business impact. Trying to run the latest and greatest software on hardware that might be 4 or 5 years old might be compromised. Might be compromised in performance. You might be compromised in support that's available from the software supplier. They might say to you, well, the operating system's out of date. We can't support you until you upgrade it, for example. These things translate into a business impact in that you've invested in the software. The business case for the software acquisition includes realisation of business benefit. If the hardware is constraining that, then the business benefits may not be available to the business. Now, one of the business case elements that we often see in a number of areas relates to security. Now, security is a subject on its own, but when it comes to infrastructure being up to date, there are particular implications from a security point of view. A few years ago, not too long ago, patching of software and operating systems was regarded as a task of maybe last resort. It wasn't something that people did as a matter of course. Whereas today, patching is on the front line of defence against security threats. So it's been a bit of a 180-degree turnaround, and the implications of running systems that are beyond current line of support, or even older and running back releases of software that might still be supported, is that patching may not be optimal, i.e. the vendor may not have provided patches for older versions, or the last patch was released 2 or 3 years ago, and so the system is not really protected against current line threats. And the other element is that systems that were implemented 4 or 5 years ago were implemented when patching was not top of mind, and so they sort of get into a set and forget mode, and quite often are not brought into a patching regime, and therefore are compromised from a security point of view, or at the very least are at a higher risk compared to a system that's running currently supported software where the patches are completely up to date. So the business impact: higher security risk, and a lower level of governance and a lower level of assurance for the business that their assets, their digital assets, are protected. Now, reliability is something that people tend to take for granted with a lot of IT systems, particularly at the hardware level, and in 99% of cases that is justified. We do see some elements that come into play as systems get older. Electronic components tend to follow a bathtub curve in terms of failure rates. So they either fail in the first little while, day or so of operating. If they get past that, then they're extremely reliable until they get towards the end of operating life, and then their failure rate increases dramatically. The way that presents in an operating environment is, it's not unusual to hear somebody say, I'm afraid to turn the machine off because it may not come back up. Cycling the power off and on introduces a volatile state, and sometimes a power supply or a voltage regulator may not take that, and you have a consequent failure. That's an unplanned outage, and then recovery from an unplanned outage is typically more difficult than from a planned outage. The other element that exposes risk in this space is just straight out power failure, and it's not unknown for systems to fail when the power comes back up after a power outage in a business. So in general, as a system pushes towards that 5-6 year type threshold, we would expect to plan for a lower level of reliability in general. Things like discs tend to start to fail towards end of life more frequently, and while you might be protected with RAID or other strategies, we fall back onto the parts availability question and how long do you have to wait, or do you buy it from eBay and things like that. Now, one thing that we see over and over again, typically with IT staff, is that the queue to look after older systems tends to be pretty short. People want to work on newer stuff, they want to work on higher value stuff and the stuff that delivers benefits to the business. Consequently, the care and feeding and maintenance of older systems tends to fall to the bottom of the queue. It either doesn't get done or it gets done at the end of the day, or the resources allocated to it are not optimal. Perversely, these systems tend to require a bit more effort just for this straight keeping the lights on operation. So as a result, running older systems mean that your limited resources in terms of IT staff, now that's whether they're your own staff or whether they're people that you contract or a service provider, are spending a disproportionate amount of time keeping older systems running, as opposed to using that limited resource working on higher value projects, i.e. deploying new systems, making improvements in the value that the business gets from its IT investment. So it's a hidden cost, but in general, when you're looking at refresh versus keeping systems for another year, keeping things going for another year does have a layer of cost in terms of running the system that's higher than running refresh systems. At some point, the CFO is going to be involved in this conversation, and the straight financial impact is depreciation. Typically, systems are brought onto the books as an asset, again in an on-premise situation, and the depreciation schedule typically looks 3, 4 or 5 years. Once the asset's fully written off, then the tax benefit of that depreciation disappears. So again, when you're looking at a total cost of ownership scenario, keeping the older assets on the books, once they're fully depreciated, there's an expense or a tax benefit that's lost to the business. And it may not be a game changer, but it is a factor that needs to be taken into account. So I'm just going to summarise those dot points. So the heading items from a business case point of view, you've got extended warranty costs, you've got service levels around maintenance agreements and parts supply. We've got operating system and application support and the possible compromises when they're not up to date. We've got security issues that need to be understood and taken into account in any sort of comparison. We have reliability and the ability to recover from an outage and the possible limitations on that and the unplanned impacts on that. We've got manpower efficiency and demands on manpower, and we have the financial impact of depreciation being fully utilised and then no more tax write-off for keeping assets beyond a certain time. So in general, what we see is that a business case for considering a refresh of assets, of IT assets, would in some form or another take into account these points. It may not be the full list, but these ones would pretty well be present in any business case that's done to a thorough degree. The methodology we use is to look at a total cost of ownership. Where possible, each of these items are quantified and added to the column A or column B, and where they can't be quantified, there is a subjective analysis put into place, and the business would need to sign off to say, for example, we can't quantify that recovering from an outage will take longer with old systems, but we can subjectively say that it's not desirable and it's not acceptable to the business, and it will sway the argument one way or the other. So that's the gist of it. You can reach out to me if you'd like more content or to discuss this in more detail. Thank you.